Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Johnson Financial Group, helping customers build financial plans around their unique goals for over 55 years. More at johnsonfinancialgroup.com. Johnson Bank and Johnson Wealth Inc. are Johnson Financial Group companies.
You're listening to Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR station. Here's one of our favorite conversations about the people, places, and organizations that shape Milwaukee.
Recent reporting from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel looked into Walgreens leases throughout the city. The reporting found that leases contain terms that restrict pharmacies and other businesses from moving into the stores. And those leases can last for decades, so long as the company continues to pay rent. One of the closed-down Walgreens locations on North King Drive and West Hadley Street has a lease that was signed in 2009 and lasts until 2084, preventing new businesses from moving in. WUWM's race and ethnicity reporter Teran Powell is joined by real estate expert Chad Venne to learn about these types of leases and their provisions.
I'll just give you kind of a general overview on how a lot of commercial leases work, and they're much different than a multifamily or residential lease that you would see in an apartment. A lot of that language is governed by state statutes, and landlords have a very strict guidelines that they have to follow to make sure that everything is legally in compliance. When you're talking about commercial leases, and that's, agreements that are in place between people who own buildings like office buildings, retail shopping centers, industrial buildings, the terms of those leases are much more negotiable. And obviously there's some legal standards that they have to follow, but they're governed a lot more by the business terms that the building owner and the tenant negotiate and come to terms with. When you talk about tenants like Walgreens, these are major, large corporate organizations, and a lot of times they operate with somewhat of a standard lease template that they start the negotiations with. And so a lot of the clauses that you see contained within these Walgreens leases, even though that there are negotiations that are going to change them site to site, many of the key provisions that are in them are just part of their standard lease that they agree to. And one of the questions I think that you had was about this idea of the exclusive use. And while it might be kind of an odd concept to, consumers in neighborhoods or people unfamiliar with this, it's actually very common in these retail leases, especially when you're dealing with these larger corporate users like a Walgreens or a CVS or a lot of grocery stores. And the intent behind the exclusive use clause is to basically protect the business from competition coming into a center. And so when these agreements are put in place, I'll use an example of like a coffee shop. If you are an operator of a coffee shop, whether that's Starbucks or even a small neighborhood coffee shop, you want some protections from the landlord being able to put a competitor in, on the same building in the same shopping center as you do, because it's going to impact your sales. And so these exclusive use clauses are in there to really guard against the tenant's business. And in the case of Walgreens, there's the discussion about the pharmacy and the other restrictions that are able to happen within that center. And so I think the intent when they're signing these leases is to really kind of protect against a landlord having the ability to put competitors in a same site, a same center to impede on their business. So in addition to the exclusive use, which kind of protects the tenant and gives them the sole right to operate that type of business in a shopping center, there's also things like the prohibited use that you see in a lot of commercial leases can call out specific things that tenants and future tenants don't have the ability to do within a center. And so sometimes those are written in there for the benefit of the landlord. And sometimes in the case of these larger corporate users, they're also put in place to kind of protect the building or the business that's operating within that building. And so a lot of these restrictions are things that either the building owner or large corporate tenants look at as a way to protect against reputation of the building, synergies of the building. And so a lot of these larger corporations, they have an image and a brand that they're trying to convey, and they want to make sure that if they're going to commit to a long-term lease in a place, that the landlord doesn't just have the ability to put any type of operation they want in a shopping center that they might view as an impact to their brand reputation or to the use that they're looking to operate. What makes these Walgreens leases so complicated is that they're so long. And so many of the base leases that you see for a store like Walgreens start at something like 25 years on average. And so 25 years is a long time. And as the economy changes, as consumer behavior changes, it's really hard to see how some of these clauses are going to play out years down the road, decades down the road. In addition to the long term that they have of these leases, many of them also have renewal clauses in there, which allow the tenant the ability to continue their lease on, usually for 5-year additional terms. And so when you look at the article in JS Online, it's referencing, I think 75 to 80 years. Well, what that's taking into consideration is the original 25 years of that lease, plus these additional renewal options that get put on the end of the lease term. And from the business's standpoint, they like those renewal options because if they're going to invest in a community, invest in a center, they want to make sure that they have the ability to maintain control of that space for a long period of time. And these leases that you see with the Walgreenses of the world are much longer than we see with a lot of traditional retailers in space, but the general terms are pretty common in the industry.
It's interesting to have these long kind of terms with just uncertainty of whether you will return. I guess that's what's kind of tripping me up a little bit.
What's hard for people that live in any community is that a lot of times these agreements happen between a user and an owner of a building. And, when they're usually on the front end of it, it's with the best intent, right? When Walgreens signs this lease, when the landlord agrees to this lease, it's to provide long-term services for these communities. So they lock in these long-term leases, I don't believe, to control and monopolize an area as much as they just want to ensure that they have control to run the business. Mm-hmm. Now, over multiple decades, as I mentioned, consumer behavior changes. And so you're seeing a lot of these stores now closing that I don't believe it was the initial intent to let's just open a bunch of stores, see what works, and then close down the ones that don't. Mm-hmm. I think it's done with the intent of we want to be here long term. Now, if you live in one of those communities, you're just kind of subject to this agreement that you had no control over, nothing to do with. Right. And it could have a big impact on the neighborhood. I think what's kind of important to know, and this is it's kind of confusing in itself as well, but the tenant is technically in a valid lease for many of these situations. And so as long as they're paying rent, mm-hmm. the original lease is still there. And certain leases have clauses in them. Like, for example, there's a clause called, a dark store or a dark closure, where if a landlord has a concern that this could happen, they have the ability to write that into a lease, that a tenant doesn't have the ability to just close a store down and stop operating in it without the lease becoming invalid. Mm-hmm. And that's the landlord's way of protecting the integrity of their center, the other tenants that are in the center. Because if you bring in a large operator like a grocery store or a pharmacy, that draws a lot of other businesses to the area. And those other businesses are there because they know the foot traffic and the pedestrians that are being brought in because of that user. And so they want to make sure that if they're going to commit to a lease that is outside of their control, that the large big box tenant that's kind of anchoring that center doesn't have the ability to just turn the lights off, walk away, stop operating, but still remain under a valid lease. That's one of those points that's negotiated, however. So if you're a landlord and you're dealing with a large credit tenant like a Walgreens, you might not have that ability to negotiate that into a lease because, frankly, some of these tenants are very desirable for owners, and so they will concede on things for these larger operators than they would, like a smaller neighborhood startup company.
Very, very fascinating.
It's a unique place to be in for these centers because and I'm speaking in generalities here. I'm not saying that this is across the board, but there could very well be a dark store with nobody operating, with no intent to move back. But as long as the tenant is still paying rent on that space, they remain a valid tenant under the terms of that lease. And with that valid lease stays those inclusive use clauses. Those prohibited use clauses they remain in effect. Now, some of these leases will also have things like sublease clauses in there, which gives the tenant the ability to try to locate another tenant to take over their lease. On occasion, there's conversations where landlords kind of recognize what's happening and they can try to negotiate to get out of that lease. But everything requires approval on both ends because the lease is the lease and it's the letter of the law until somebody is in default. And as long as they continue to pay and they're operating under the terms of their lease, there's really limited legal action that could be taken.
I'm glad you said that because I had a question about whether, it even makes sense to take legal action in these cases. Are you aware of any other, like if it's elsewhere, if it's Milwaukee area, like if there have been any like legal challenges or like pushback to situations like this?
Sure. There's been challenges to these in areas like San Francisco, New York, bigger cities that, don't. What they're trying to implement, and I don't have all the specifics to this, but I know that certain municipalities are trying to add like a vacancy tax would be a way of looking at it. So if you're going to just own a property and not have anything operating in there, you still have the legal ability to do so, but they're going to try to charge you some sort of a tax or a fee to try to encourage landlords and tenants to renegotiate these terms to get out of it because nobody wants to see an empty storefront. I mean, the building owner doesn't, other tenants don't want, neighbors don't want it, cities don't want it. So there are a lot of areas where people are trying to work on ways that, they can work around it. But legally, as far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of anything here locally that has been successful or anything that's even been discussed that could kind of operate along those same terms.
So I guess my final question, can you speak to the barriers this creates for those? I said, earlier, it's predominantly been Black and brown communities where these Walgreens have closed. And with these exclusions, certain industries cannot open up because of these, term agreements. Can you just speak to like the barriers that this might create for those communities?
Yeah, it creates a very challenging situation, no doubt. You have what were kind of center points of many communities. Walgreens was kind of notorious for getting the best locations in each area. And it's got to be very challenging for people who live in those communities who have these prime centers that don't have an operating service providing those needs anymore. And it create some legal challenges because, as I stated, these leases don't really have a way to unwind them without people agreeing to do so. And if there were another operator or another user that would be willing to step in to that space, in many cases, it's going to require Walgreens or the tenant in this case to sign off on it, and then the owner to sign off on it as well. And if Walgreens is in place with a really strong lease, it's going to require probably somebody at that level to step in to take over the lease for everyone to be able to agree to it. And so it's got to be very frustrating for people in the communities that have relied on these services that don't have that asset anymore that they can rely on. And it doesn't have a really easy answer to it. And if you're people who live in areas where this is affected by you, I do imagine it puts a lot of extra stress and strain on trying to have to find ways to kind of relocate those services that are there. From a real estate perspective, it is challenging though, and I think if there was an easy answer, people would be able to try to figure out ways to solve it. The hope would be that another operator sees promise in a neighborhood or a community and sees the value in it and wants to be able to approach either the owner or the tenant to take over and run their business there.
Chad Venne is the director of the real estate program with UW-Milwaukee's Lubar School of Business. He spoke with WUWM's race and ethnicity reporter Teran Powell.
That was the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast. It comes from your local NPR station, WUWM. Subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast to hear more great stories about Milwaukee.